The hours following the battle passed in tense silence as the disabled Crethony fleet drifted helplessly through space. Supreme Commander Vorath stood on the darkened bridge of the Dominance, surrounded by officers who avoided meeting his eyes, and contemplated the ruins of everything he had built. His entire military career had been dedicated to expanding the Dominion's power, conquering species who could not defend themselves, and crushing any resistance with overwhelming force. Now the career lay in ashes, destroyed not by superior weapons, but by a signal that had made his weapons irrelevant. Supreme Commander called Sub-Commander Kethra, his second in command. The humans are transmitting again. Vorath waved his hand in dismissal, unwilling to hear more terms from the enemy who had humiliated him. Kethra hesitated before speaking again. Supreme Commander, they are offering to restore our life support to full functionality immediately, with propulsion following within the next few hours. At what cost? Vorath demanded. No cost, Supreme Commander. They state that the restoration is unconditional and that our crews should not suffer for the decisions of their leaders. The mercy burned worse than defeat. Vorath had conquered dozens of species throughout his career, and he had never shown such consideration to his enemies. Prisoners were useful as labor or as examples, not as recipients of compassion. Tell them we refuse their charity. Kethra's scales shifted to a shade that indicated deep concern. Supreme Commander, our life support systems are operating at minimal capacity, and several ships are reporting dangerous temperature fluctuations. Then our crews will endure. Sub-Commander, with respect, Supreme Commander, our crew should not die because we are too proud to accept help from the species that defeated us. Vorath turned to face his subordinate, ready to deliver a scathing reprimand, but stopped when he saw something unfamiliar in Kethra's eyes. Was not fear or submission or respect, it was judgment. You believe I am making a mistake. Sub-Commander, I believe that our duty is to our crews first, Supreme Commander, and our pride second. The words hung in the air between them as other officers watched the exchange with growing tension. Vorath had executed subordinates for lesser challenges to his authority, but something in this moment felt different. Perhaps it was the darkness of the dead bridge, or the silence of systems that refused to respond, or the simple fact that his power to execute anyone had been stripped away along with everything else. You would accept help from humans. Sub-Commander, I would accept help from anyone if it meant keeping my crew alive. Supreme Commander, Vorath stared at Kethra for a long moment before turning away to face the viewport. Do as you wish. Sub-Commander, Kethra immediately contacted the human fleet and accepted their offer. And within minutes, the temperature aboard the Dominance began stabilizing on the Coalition Command Center at Vareth. High Coordinator Thelvax struggled to process the implications of what he had witnessed, had called an emergency meeting of all remaining Coalition representatives, and they gathered in the war room with expressions ranging from relief to terror. The humans have revealed themselves as the most powerful species in the galaxy, declared the Tethany representative, his forearms gesturing frantically. They could disable any fleet, conquer any world, and dominate us all. Yet they chose to spare the Crethony crews, observed the Mallory delegate, her gelatinous form rippling with what might have been confusion. That is not the behavior of conquerors. Perhaps they are simply waiting for a more advantageous moment to strike, suggested the Varthani. Admiral Thelvax listened to the arguments while Ambassador Jinwoo Park stood silently at the back of the room. The human diplomat had maintained a calm demeanor throughout the crisis, as if the revelation of his species' true capabilities was nothing remarkable. Ambassador Park, Thelvax finally called. Perhaps you can explain your species' intentions. Park stepped forward with the same easy confidence he had displayed since his first day in the Coalition High Coordinator. My government has authorized me to share certain information that may help ease your concerns. He paused to ensure he had everyone's attention. Humanity has possessed the capability to disable galactic technology for approximately 15 years. And during that time, we have never used it aggressively against any species. Then why develop such a weapon at all? Demanded the Tethany representative. Because we watched this galaxy tear itself apart with wars of conquest for decades before making first contact. And we decided that we would never allow ourselves to become victims of such conquest. Park's expression shifted to something more serious. But we also decided that we would never become conquerors ourselves. Because our own history taught us where that path leads. The Vorthani admiral leaned forward with suspicion in his eyes. You expect us to believe that a species capable of ruling the galaxy has no interest in doing so. I expect nothing, Admiral. But I can share our reasoning if you wish to understand. Park walked toward the large display screen that still showed the drifting. Crethany fleet. Humanity spent thousands of years conquering ourselves, building empires that rose and fell in endless cycles of violence. And we learned something important from that experience. He turned to face the assembled representatives. Conquest does not work. At least not permanently, because conquered peoples always eventually rebel. And the cost of maintaining control always eventually exceeds the benefits of possession. So you simply gave up on power? The Tethany representative asked with obvious disbelief. No. We redefined what power means. Park gestured toward the viewport where human ships maintained their positions around the disabled Crethany fleet. True power is not the ability to destroy your enemies, because destruction creates new enemies who seek revenge. True power is the ability to make conflict itself pointless. Aboard the Resolve, Admiral Sion received reports from her captains as the restoration of Crethany systems proceeded on schedule. Captain Myre Choi of the carrier Indomitable contacted her with an update on the flagship Dominance. Admiral, we have detected an interesting development aboard the Crethany command ship. Report. Captain, Supreme Commander Vorath has been relieved of command by his sub-commander, and the new commander has been much more cooperative with our restoration efforts. Sion allowed herself a small smile at that news. The Crethany military hierarchy was already beginning to fracture under the weight of their defeat, and that fracturing would spread throughout the Dominion once word reached their conquered territories. Continue the restoration as planned, Captain, and ensure that all Crethany vessels receive equal treatment regardless of their crew's attitudes. Understood. Admiral, though I must ask a question if you will permit it. Speak freely. Captain, Choi hesitated before voicing her concern. Are we certain this is the right approach, Admiral? Because some of my officers believe we should use this advantage to eliminate the Crethany threat permanently. Sion considered the question carefully before responding. Captain, do you know why humanity spent so long hiding our capabilities from the galaxy? I assumed it was strategic. Admiral, to maintain the element of surprise. That was part of it. But the larger reason was that we needed time to decide what kind of species we wanted to be. Sion looked out at the stars that surrounded her fleet. We could have revealed ourselves years ago and used our advantage to build an empire that would have made the Crethany look like amateurs. But our leaders decided that we had already tried empire building on Earth and found it wanting. She turned back to face the communication screen. Today we proved that humanity cannot be conquered, Captain, and tomorrow we will prove something even more important. What is that? Admiral, that humanity chooses not to conquer, even when conquest would be easy. Because we learned long ago that the only lasting victory is one where everyone wins. Choi nodded slowly as understanding dawned in her eyes. I will ensure my crew understands the mission. Admiral, thank you, Captain. And please remind them that the Crethany soldiers on those ships are not our enemies anymore. They are our future allies, whether they know it yet or not. The bridge of the Crethany flagship Dominance descended into absolute pandemonium as every system failed simultaneously, Supreme Commander. Vorath screamed orders that no one could follow because the communication networks had gone silent. The tactical displays had turned to static, and the lights themselves flickered in erratic patterns that made the chaos even more disorienting. Report. Vorath bellowed into the darkness. Someone tell me what is happening. An officer stumbled toward him through the emergency lighting, her scales pale with terror. Supreme Commander. All systems are failing across the entire fleet. That is impossible, Vorath snarled. Our ships use completely isolated computer cores with no external network connections. It is not a network attack. Supreme Commander, the systems themselves are being rewritten at the fundamental level, across the void of space. 300 Crethany warships experienced the exact same catastrophic failure within seconds of each other. Navigation computers forgot how to calculate trajectories, weapons. Systems locked into permanent safety modes. Engine controls reversed themselves, sending ships spinning wildly off course. Life support began cycling through random temperature and atmospheric settings aboard the heavy cruiser Vengeance. Captain Korath watched his bridge crew scramble desperately to regain control of systems that no longer responded to any command. Engineering. What is our status? He shouted into a communicator that produced only static. The lights went out entirely, plunging the bridge into darkness for 3 terrifying seconds before emergency power kicked in with a sickly yellow glow. Young officer managed to access a backup terminal and read the diagnostic data with growing horror. Captain, our quantum processors are being overwritten by an external signal. Overwritten with what? Nothing. Captain, they are being overwritten with blank code that erases everything our systems know how to do. Korath felt his blood turn cold as he realized the implications. The Crethany Dominion had spent centuries perfecting their military technology, building weapons that could shatter planets and shields that could withstand almost any attack. All of that power meant nothing if the computers that controlled those systems forgot how to function on the flagship Dominance. Vorath finally received a partial report from his chief engineer, who had physically climbed through maintenance corridors to reach the bridge. Supreme Commander, we have identified the source of the attack. Then stop it, Vorath demanded. We cannot. Supreme Commander, because the signal operates on principles our systems are not designed to recognize. The engineer's hand shook as he tried to explain something that violated everything he understood about technology. Human computers work differently than ours, Supreme Commander, as they developed their technology in complete isolation from the galactic standard. What does that mean? It means their systems speak a language that ours do not understand. But our systems are trying to understand it anyway. And the attempt is destroying our ability to function. Vorath stared at his engineer with dawning comprehension that felt like ice forming in his chest. Are you telling me that the humans attacked us with incompatible software? In simplified terms, yes, Supreme Commander. They transmitted a signal that our quantum processors tried to interpret, and the interpretation process overrode our core programming. High Coordinator Thelvax watched from the Coalition Command Center as the Crethany fleet transformed from an unstoppable armada into a drifting collection of dead metal. His officers reported the impossible in voices that trembled with disbelief. High Coordinator, the Crethany vessels have lost all power signatures. They are not destroyed, asked the Vorthani Admiral. Negative, Admiral. The ships appear intact, but their systems have completely failed. Thelvax turned to the communication screen where Admiral Siang's face remained as calm as it had been throughout the entire engagement. Admiral, what did you do to them? We turned them off. High Coordinator, turn them off, Thelvax repeated, unable to process the simple phrase. Every spacefaring civilization in this galaxy built their technology on foundations established by the precursors millions of years ago. Xiang explained. You all use the same basic quantum processing architecture because you all learned from the same ancient sources. She paused to let that information settle. Humanity developed our technology independently. High Coordinator, and when we finally encountered alien systems, our engineers noticed something fascinating. What did they notice? Admiral, they noticed that your systems have a fundamental vulnerability that ours do not share. And we spent decades learning how to exploit that vulnerability. The implications crashed over. Thelvax like a wave of cold water. You can disable any fleet in the galaxy. Any fleet that uses standard galactic technology. Yes, aboard the Dominance, Supreme Commander. Vorath finally managed to restore partial communication with a handful of ships using backup systems that predated quantum processors. The reports he received painted a picture of total defeat. Supreme Commander, we have lost main power on all vessels. Weapon systems are permanently locked. Navigation is non-functional. And engines will not respond to commands. What about our fighters and smaller craft? All affected, Supreme Commander. As anything with a quantum processor has been disabled, Vorath slammed his fist against a console that refused to respond to his touch. He had commanded the most powerful fleet in the galaxy just minutes ago. And now he commanded nothing but drifting hulks. How many casualties? He asked. Dreading the answer, the pause before the response confused him. None. Supreme Commander. None, Vorath repeated. The attack did not target life support directly, and while it has been fluctuating, no deaths have been reported across the fleet. That detail somehow made the defeat even more humiliating. The humans had not simply beaten the Crethini Dominion. They had beaten them without even trying to kill Thema. New voice crackled through the damaged communication system, and Vorath recognized it as the human admiral. Supreme Commander Vorath, this is Admiral Xiang, and I hope you can hear me through your remaining backup systems. Vorath considered not responding, but pride demanded that he face his enemy. I hear you, Admiral. Good, because I want you to understand something important about what just happened. Xiang's voice remained calm and professional. Without any trace of gloating or mockery, my fleet could have destroyed your ships instead of simply disabling them. Supreme Commander, and the choice to spare your crews was deliberate. Why? Vorath spat. Why show mercy to an enemy you have defeated so completely? Because killing your soldiers would not end this war. Supreme Commander, it would only create martyrs and fuel demands for revenge. Vorath listened in silence as the human continued. The Crethini Dominion has terrorized this galaxy for generations, conquering species and destroying anyone who resisted. But that era ends today. You cannot end an empire with a single battle. Admiral, I am not trying to end an empire, Supreme Commander. I am trying to demonstrate that conquest has become pointless. Admiral Xiang looked out at the drifting Crethini fleet through her viewport and felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. Humanity had hidden its true capabilities for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. And that moment had finally arrived. The galaxy would never be the same. And she could only hope that the change would be for the better. Your ships will be restored to minimal functionality within 6 hours, Supreme Commander, and you will be allowed to return home with your crews intact. And if we refuse your terms, then you will drift in space until you change your mind. Supreme Commander, because we have all the time in the universe and you do not. Vorath had no response to that simple truth. For the first time in his long military career, he faced an enemy he could not fight, could not threaten, and could not defeat through any means at his disposal. The humans had not won through superior firepower or better tactics. They had won by making his firepower and tactics completely irrelevant, and that realization was more terrifying than any weapon he had ever faced. The space around Varath had grown quiet in the hours before the storm as coalition forces pulled back to defensive positions around the planet itself. Hi. Coordinator Thelvax watched the countdown timer that marked the estimated arrival of the Crethany fleet. Knowing that his civilization's final hours were ticking away, with merciless precision his compound eyes ached from staring at tactical displays. And his body demanded rest that his mind refused to allow. High Coordinator called his communications officer. We are detecting hyperspace distortions at the edge of the system. Thelvax straightened from his slouched position and focused on the main display. The Crethany have arrived early, he said, feeling the last of his hope crumble into dust. Negative, High Coordinator. The signatures do not match Crethany vessels. The display flickered as sensors struggled to process what they were detecting. One contact became 10, then 50, then hundreds. The numbers climbing so rapidly that the system could barely keep track. What is happening? Demanded the Vorthani admiral, who stood beside Thelvax. Hyperspace exit confirmed, the sensor officer reported, his voice rising with each word. Coalition identification protocols indicate these are human vessels. High Coordinator. How many? Thelvax whispered. The answer came as the display finally stabilized, showing a wall of blue contacts that stretched across an enormous section of space. 2,147 confirmed vessels, High Coordinator, with more still translating into normal space. Silence fell across the command center as every officer stopped their work to stare at the impossible sight. The humans, who supposedly possess fewer than 30 ships, had just arrived with a fleet larger than any force the galaxy had. Seen in 3 Centauri S, Thelvax gripped the railing before him as his legs threatened to give way beneath the weight of his. Shock. That cannot be correct, the Vorthani admiral said. Run the scan again. I have confirmed 3 times, Admiral. And the count is accurate. Aboard the human flagship Resolve. Admiral Unision observed the tactical display with calm satisfaction as her fleet assumed formation. Lieutenant Commander Dongguan Li worked at his station with practiced efficiency, coordinating the positioning of over 2,000 vessels with the help of systems that have been designed specifically for this moment. Admiral, coalition forces are hailing us, reported the communications officer. Put them through. High Coordinator Thelvax's face appeared on the screen, his compound eyes wide with an expression that Seong had learned to recognize as profound shock. Admiral Seong. Thelvax managed after several seconds of stunned silence. I must confess that I am struggling to understand what I'm seeing. High Coordinator. The Human Confederacy takes its alliance obligations very seriously, Seong replied with a slight smile. We apologize for the delay in our response. Where did these ships come from, Admiral? As our intelligence indicated, your species possessed only a handful of vessels. Your intelligence was based on what we chose to show you, High Coordinator, and we felt it was prudent to keep certain capabilities private until they were needed, before Thelvax could respond. Alarms began sounding throughout both command centers. The Crethany fleet had arrived. Supreme Commander Vorath emerged from hyperspace, expecting to find a broken coalition fleet ready for slaughter. But instead, his sensors reported something that made his scales turn pale with confusion. What is the meaning of this? He demanded as his display filled with enemy contacts. Where did those ships come from? Unknown, Supreme Commander. But we are detecting over 2,000 vessels of human origin. Vorath stared at the tactical display as his officers scrambled to reassess the situation. The humans had somehow assembled a fleet that rivaled his own in numbers. Though his confidence remained intact as he considered their primitive technology, it matters not how many ships they bring, Vorath declared, forcing certainty into his voice. Human vessels lack proper weapons and shielding, meaning they will burn just as easily whether they number 30 or 3,000. He opened a channel to broadcast across all frequencies. Human Commander, This is Supreme Commander Vorath of the Crethany Dominion, and I offer you one chance to withdraw your fleet before I am forced to destroy it." Admiral Siong received the transmission with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the operation. "Supreme Commander Vorath," she replied, her voice carrying across the void between their fleets. "I am Admiral Yuna Siong of the Human Confederacy, and I must return your offer with one of my own." She paused, letting the silence build before continuing. "Withdraw your forces from Coalition space immediately and return all conquered territories to their original inhabitants, or face consequences that you cannot currently imagine." Vorath laughed, a harsh and mocking sound that echoed across the open channel. "You threaten me with primitive ships that my sensors can barely detect as military vessels, Admiral, as your weapon signatures are so weak that I initially mistook your fleet for civilian transports. Your sensors are showing you exactly what we want them to show you." "Supreme Commander, enough of this foolishness," Vorath snapped. "All ships advance and destroy the human fleet. Then proceed to planetary bombardment as planned." 300 Crethany warships surged forward, their weapons charging with the distinctive energy signatures of plasma lances and quantum torpedoes aboard the Resolve. Lieutenant Commander Lee watched the enemy approach with professional detachment. "Admiral, Crethany fleet is advancing at attack speed, and they will enter weapons range in 4 minutes. Status of full spectrum synchronization." Siong asked. "All fleet elements report synchronized and ready." "Admiral." Siong nodded and turned to face the viewport where the distant lights of the Crethany fleet grew brighter as they approached. She thought about all the years of preparation, the secret shipyards hidden in asteroid fields, the technology developed in laboratories that officially did not exist, and the countless simulations that had led to this moment. Humanity had watched the galaxy tear itself apart with wars of conquest for decades before making contact, and they had learned valuable lessons from that observation. Every spacefaring civilization built their technology on similar foundations. Quantum processors that operated according to principles discovered by ancient species millions of years ago had developed differently, isolated from that technological inheritance. And human engineers had noticed something fascinating when they finally examined alien systems. There was a vulnerability, a fundamental flaw in the architecture that every species shared, and humans had spent years learning how to exploit it. "Admiral, enemy fleet entering weapons range in 30 seconds. Siong drew a deep breath and spoke the words that would change galactic history. "Signal all ships to begin. Transmission on my mark." Every human vessel oriented itself toward the approaching Crethany fleet, their hulls humming with energy that no alien sensor could properly identify. "Mark." The human fleet did not fire weapons in any conventional sense. Instead, 2,000 ships simultaneously broadcast a precisely calibrated signal that crossed the distance between the fleets at the speed of light. Supreme Commander Vorath had exactly 3 seconds to wonder why his tactical display had suddenly gone dark before chaos erupted across his entire fleet, and in those 3 seconds, everything changed. The warning lights bathed the command center in deep crimson as High Coordinator Thelvac stood before the massive display screen that showed the dying remains of his coalition's defensive line. 3 years of war had reduced the once mighty Galactic Coalition to a shadow of its former self. And now the final battle approached with terrible certainty. Thelvac's compound eyes scanned the tactical display where red markers representing Crethany warships outnumbered the blue coalition vessels by nearly 4 to 1. High Coordinator called one of his officers, a reptilian Vorthani whose scales had turned pale with stress. "The Crethany fleet has breached the outer defensive perimeter, and they will reach Vareth within 16 hours. Thelvax clicked his mandibles in frustration as he watched another blue marker vanish from the display 7. Member species had already fallen to the Crethany Dominion's relentless advance, and billions of citizens now lived under occupation. Insectoid leader had ruled the coalition for 40 years and had never faced a threat this severe as predecessors had built this alliance to ensure mutual protection. Yet now that protection seemed like a cruel joke. What reserves do we have remaining? Thelvax asked, though he already knew the answer would bring no comfort. 17 capital ships, High Coordinator, along with 32 support vessels and approximately 90 fighters, against the Crethany armada of over 300 warships. Those numbers meant nothing. Thelvax turned away from the display and walked toward the tall windows that overlooked the capital city. Below, millions of his people lived in those gleaming towers, trusting their leaders to keep them safe, and he had failed. Thema soft chime announced an incoming communication, and Thelvax felt his heart sink when he saw the identifier ambassador, Jinwoo Park of the Human Confederacy, stood waiting on the channel, his strange flat face displaying what Thelvax had learned to recognize as concern. Humans were the newest members of the coalition, having joined only 8 months ago after first contact revealed their existence on a small blue world at the galaxy's edge. Thelvax had voted against their admission, considering them too primitive and too unknown to trust. But desperation had overruled caution. High Coordinator, Park said as the connection opened, his voice calm despite the circumstances. I have been monitoring the tactical situation, and I believe my government can offer assistance. Thelvax suppressed a bitter laugh that would have been inappropriate for his station. The humans possessed perhaps 24 ships that coalition observers had documented, vessels that appeared almost comically underpowered compared to proper warships. Their technology seemed decades behind every other spacefaring species, with crude propulsion systems and weapons that barely qualified as military grade. Ambassador Park, I appreciate your government's willingness to help, but I must be honest with you, Thelvax replied, choosing his words with diplomatic care. The Crethany fleet represents the most powerful military force in the known galaxy, and I fear your vessels would serve only as additional targets. Park's expression shifted into something Thelvax could not quite read. Perhaps amusement mixed with something harder beneath the surface. High Coordinator, my government has authorized me to inform you that Admiral Yuna Seong will arrive with a relief fleet within 40 hours. 40 hours, Thelvax repeated, feeling hope flicker and die almost instantly. The Crethany will have conquered Varath within 20 hours at their current pace. Then Admiral Seong will arrive to liberate it. Park said simply, please ensure your remaining forces do not engage the Crethany directly until we arrive, as we would prefer to handle this matter ourselves. The audacity of that statement nearly made Thelvax dismiss the ambassador entirely handle this matter themselves, as if the humans could simply wave away a fleet that had crushed 7 civilizations. I will relay your offer to my military commanders, Thelvax said with forced politeness, and we will coordinate as circumstances allow. After the communication ended, Thelvax summoned his senior advisors for an emergency council. They gathered in the war room within the hour. Representatives from the 6 remaining coalition species, who had not yet surrendered or been conquered. The humans have offered military assistance, Thelvax announced, watching their reactions carefully. Before Thani, Admiral hissed with something between amusement and despair. The humans have no military worth mentioning, High Coordinator, as their ships lack proper shielding and their weapons could barely scratch a Crethany hull. Perhaps they intend to ram the enemy vessels, suggested a Mallory delegate, a gelatinous form rippling with what might have been dark humor. Whatever their intentions, we cannot rely on primitive newcomers to save us, declared the Tethany representative, his forearms crossed in a gesture of dismissal. We should begin evacuation procedures for essential personnel and accept that Vareth will fall. Thelvax listened to their arguments while staring at the tactical display that showed their doom approaching with mechanical precision. He thought about the humans he had met during the admission proceedings. Strange creatures who walked on two legs and communicated through bizarre facial movements. They had seemed so confident during those meetings, so certain of their place in the galaxy, despite their obvious technological inferiority. Perhaps that confidence was simply ignorance, the blissful unawareness of species who had never faced true galactic warfare. Meanwhile, across the void of space, Supreme Commander Vorath of the Crethany Dominion reviewed the intelligence reports aboard his flagship with satisfaction. Supreme Commander, our scouts report an incoming fleet bearing human identification signatures, reported his sensor officer Vorath. S. scale shifted to a darker shade of pleased anticipation as he examined the data. Humans, he said, savoring the word like a predator contemplating easy prey. Tell me about these humans. A newly contacted species from the Outer Rim, Supreme Commander, with minimal technological development and no documented military engagements. And they believe they can challenge the Dominion, Vorath laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the command deck. How many vessels? Unknown at this time, Supreme Commander, though Coalition records suggest they possess fewer than 30 ships total. Vorath dismissed the report with a gesture of contempt. The humans would provide a brief amusement before the main conquest. Nothing more than insects to be crushed beneath the Dominion's superior might. He had heard stories about these creatures, how they came from a heavy-gravity world and possessed unusual endurance. But endurance meant nothing against plasma lances and quantum torpedoes, far away in the darkness between stars. Admiral Yuna stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the countdown timer approach zero around her. Officers from 17 different Earth nations worked in perfect coordination, their old rivalries forgotten in service to something greater. Admiral, all fleet elements report ready for hyperspace translation, announced Lieutenant Commander Dongwan Li from the tactical station. Singh nodded once, her face calm and her eyes reflecting the starlight that streamed through the viewport. She had trained for this moment her entire career, preparing for the day when humanity would reveal its true capabilities to a galaxy that had dismissed them as primitives. Signal all ships, Siang ordered, her voice carrying the weight of history. Execute translation on my mark. 2,147 human vessels powered their drives in perfect synchronization. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity had been watching, learning, and preparing for far longer than anyone suspected. Mark. The fleet vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind only the fading glow of their engines and the promise of something the Crethany had never encountered. They were coming, and nothing would ever be the same. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Vareth, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Crethany Dominion had collapsed within weeks of their fleet's return home, as word spread across their conquered territories that the mighty military had been defeated without a single shot fired. Species that had lived under occupation for generations rose in rebellion, and the Dominion's remaining forces discovered that their weapons could be disabled at any moment by human ships that seemed to appear from nowhere. High Coordinator Thelvax stood before the Galactic Coalition Assembly, now expanded to include representatives from 17 new species who had joined after their liberation from Crethany rule. The chamber buzzed with conversation in dozens of languages, all translated by systems that somehow felt less reliable now that everyone knew they could be turned off by a human signal. This assembly will come to order, Thelvax announced, his voice carrying across the vast hall. The conversations faded as representatives took their seats, and all eyes turned toward the human delegation that occupied a section near the front of the chamber. Admiral Yuna stood among them, her uniform decorated with new medals that recognized her role in ending the Crethany threat. "We have gathered today to discuss the future of our coalition," Telvax continued, "and specifically to address concerns that have been raised about humanity's role in that future." A murmur rippled through the assembly as delegates exchanged meaningful glances. The Tethani representative rose to speak first. His forearms folded in a gesture of formal address. "High Coordinator, I must voice the concern that many of us share, but few have been willing to express openly." He turned to face the human delegation directly. "Humanity possesses the ability to disable any fleet in the galaxy, which means that humanity could conquer us all if they chose to do so. What guarantee do we have that they will not make that choice tomorrow, or next year, or a century from now?" The question hung in the air as Admiral Siong rose to respond. "Representative, your concern is valid, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise." She stepped forward to address the entire assembly. "Humanity could indeed use our technology to build an empire that would dominate this galaxy for generations, and nothing you could do would stop us." The chamber fell absolutely silent at that blunt admission. "But empire is not what we want. And today I am authorized to prove that claim with actions rather than words." Siong activated a display that showed technical schematics unfamiliar to most of the assembly. "These are the specifications for defensive countermeasures that will protect your systems from the type of attack we used against the Crethany fleet." Gasps echoed through the chamber as delegates realized what they were seeing. "My government has decided to share this technology freely with every member of the coalition, and with any other species that wishes to receive it." The Vorthani admiral surged to his feet with an expression of disbelief. "You would give away your greatest advantage, Admiral, the weapon that makes you invincible." "We are not giving away a weapon, Admiral. We are giving away a shield." Siam's calm demeanor never wavered as she explained. "Once every species possesses these countermeasures, no one will be able to use system-disabling attacks against anyone else, including us. But that means you will lose your power." The Mallory delegate protested. "No, it means we will share our power, which is very different, High Coordinator." Telvax leaned forward with his compound eyes fixed on the human admiral. "Help us understand your reasoning, Admiral, because this decision seems to contradict everything we know about how civilizations behave." Siong nodded and took a moment to gather her thoughts before responding. "High Coordinator, humanity spent thousands of years learning a lesson that cost us billions of lives and countless generations of suffering." She paused to let those words settle. "We learned that power hoarded is power that will eventually be challenged, and power challenged leads to conflict, and conflict leads to destruction that harms everyone. The only way to end that cycle is to make power something that everyone possesses equally, so that no one can dominate and no one needs to fear domination." Ambassador Jinwoo Park stepped forward to stand beside the Admiral. "My species tried conquest, High Coordinator, and we tried empire, and we tried every form of domination that creative minds could devise. None of it worked permanently, and all of it caused suffering that we still remember with shame." He gestured toward the viewport where stars glittered against the infinite darkness. "When we finally reached the stars and discovered that the galaxy was full of species making the same mistakes we had made, we decided to try something different. We decided to be the species that ends the cycle instead of perpetuating it." The assembly erupted into debate as delegates argued among themselves about the implications of humanity's offer. Some called it a trap, others called it foolishness, and a few called it the most generous act in galactic history. Telvax watched the chaos with something approaching wondering. All his years of leadership, he had never seen anything like this, a species with absolute power choosing to give that power away later that evening. Ambassador Park stood on an observation deck overlooking the coalition capital city. joined by a group of alien diplomats who had approached him with questions they were too nervous to ask in the assembly. Young Vorthani Attach finally voiced what everyone was thinking. Ambassador, how did your species develop such a strange philosophy? Because everything in nature teaches us that the strong dominate the weak. Park smiled and looked up at the stars that filled the night sky. That is true for animals who cannot imagine anything beyond the next meal or the next mating season. He turned to face his audience. But intelligent species can imagine futures that do not yet exist, and can choose to work toward those futures even when it requires sacrifice in the present. Humanity imagined a galaxy where no one needed to fear conquest, where species could cooperate instead of compete, where the energy spent on warfare could be redirected toward exploration and discovery and the simple joy of existence. And then we decided to make that imagination real. The Vorthani Attach considered this for a long moment. But what if you are wrong? Ambassador. And another species uses the countermeasures you provide to develop new weapons that can threaten even humans. Park nodded at the valid concern. Then we will face that challenge when it arrives. And we will find a solution that does not require us to abandon our principles. He looked back toward the stars. The galaxy is vast and full of dangers we have not yet imagined. And humanity cannot face those dangers alone. We need allies. Real allies who stand with us by choice rather than by force. And the only way to earn such allies is to prove that we deserve their trust. Far above the planet, the human fleet maintained its position alongside coalition vessels. A visible reminder of the new order that was taking shape. Admiral Sion stood on the bridge of the Resolve and reviewed reports from across the Diosta galaxy. The Crethany homeworld had requested humanitarian assistance, and human ships were already delivering supplies to populations that had been neglected by their former rulers. Former Crethany military officers were being recruited to help maintain order during the transition. And many had expressed relief that the endless cycle of conquest had finally ended on dozens of liberated worlds. Species that had never known freedom were taking their first steps toward self-governance, supported by coalition advisors and protected by the knowledge that no fleet could threaten them again. It would take years, perhaps generations, for the galaxy to fully adjust to the new reality that humanity had created. Old grudges would not disappear overnight, and trust would need to be earned through countless small actions over time. But for the first time in recorded galactic history, the future held the promise of something other than conquest and resistance, domination and rebellion. The endless cycle that had consumed civilizations for millions of years, humanity had arrived with a fleet that ended a war in seconds, and then had done something far more remarkable. They had chosen to share their victory with everyone, even their enemies, because they understood that the only way to win permanently was to make sure that everyone won in somewhere in the vast darkness between stars. Other species were watching and wondering if perhaps they too could imagine a different kind of future. The galaxy would never be the same. And that was exactly what humanity had intended all along.